Welcome back.
Welcome back, family, to Hear Us Out. I'm Renee.
I'm Kareem.
And once again, I want to say thank you to our longtime subscribers and to the new subscribers who are here. Make sure to hit, subscribe to continue to hear us out.
Huh.
And we're going to continue with our reading of W.E.B. Du Bois, um, The Souls of Black Folk. And in our previous, episode, we read, I guess it's the second essay,
hmm
and where he
Of the dawn of freedom.
right, where he really gets into the depths of the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line,
hmm
and so in that particular vein he goes through and discusses the the success, I guess, and failure of
Yeah,
the Freedmen's Bureau.
it was kind of
A history lesson,
a
actually.
history and
Uh-huh.
a summary and a exposition
Mm-hmm.
on the reaction that America had to its new black population.
Mm-hmm.
After the
Right.
Civil War and how it went about trying to, you could say, integrate this new population into itself and
Mm-hmm.
its success and failures at doing that.
Right. And the thing that he really honed on was the intentionality that was really put forth in trying to implement something of this magnitude at a time where the fervor or the feelings of so many of the populace, but still, you know, the the racism, the hatred, those type of things. And so one of the things that I found, very pressing, particularly in chapter 2, is that he was stressing how people were intentional in trying to do the right thing. And sometimes
Something approaching.
something approaching that, and that it has to be done with that type of intention, particularly when you think about how slavery was imposed. It was something that was intentional. So in order to try to repair that type of damage, that you have to use the same type of intention, or even more in this case, to try to remedy the problems that lay bare now after the Civil War. And so
So
you
yeah,
know yeah, we fell short, you know in that. And the reason why we fell short, I guess, is because there was something intentional in that too.
it was like we said, a victim of the times.
Mm-hmm.
It was at that time, like he said, doomed to failure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so today we're going to read essay 3
Chapter 3.
of Mr. Booker T. Washington and others.
hmm
And
Like we said before, the Souls of Black Folks kind of was created as a response
mm-hmm.
to Booker T. Washington and
Mm-hmm.
primarily Booker T. Washington's Atlanta Compromise,
Mm-hmm.
which was a speech that Booker T. Washington gave, I think, in
5,
1895.
yeah. Uh-huh.
In 1895, at the Cotton States and industrial expose
Yeah,
type of,
something, yeah.
it
Mm-hmm.
was a um, a meeting,
Mm-hmm.
a committee of you could say of business types,
Mm-hmm.
and cotton states and industrial types who all kind of came together for this organization. And Booker T. Washington gave a speech
Mm-hmm.
that kind of, you could say, I'm going to let W.E.B. Du Bois really
Right.
get into it, but I think that the whole crux of the speech was that uh, black people shouldn't prioritize integration and higher education
And
at
civil right
this
and
in
rights.
civil rights
Mm-hmm.
at this particular moment.
Mm-hmm.
That right now we should prioritize like trade jobs
Mm-hmm.
and
Building wealth, I
and
guess. Yeah.
building wealth and
Uh-huh.
trying to bring ourselves out of the squalor that we found ourselves in the uh, after emancipation.
Right. So,
So
yeah.
yeah.
Mm-hmm. Of Mr. Booker T. Washington and others. From birth till death enslaved, in word, in deed, unmanned, hereditary bondsmen. Know ye not, who would be free themselves must strike the blow? Easily the most striking thing in the history of the American Negro since 1876 is the ascendancy of Mr. Booker T. Washington. It began at a time when war memories and ideals were rapidly passing. A day of astonishing commercial development was dawning. A sense of doubt and hesitation overtook the freedmen's sons. Then it was that his leading began. Mr. Washington came with a single definite program at the psychological moment when the nation was a little ashamed of having bestowed so much sentiment on Negroes and was concentrating its energies on dollars. His program of industrial education, conciliation of the South, and submission in silence as to civil and political rights was not wholly original. The free Negroes from 1830 up to wartime had striven to build industrial schools, and the American Missionary Association had from the first taught various trades, and Price and others had sought a way of honorable alliance with the best of the Southerners. But Mr. Washington first indissolubly linked these things. He put enthusiasm, unlimited energy, and perfect faith into this program and changed it from a bypath into a veritable way of life. And the tale of the methods by which he did this is a fascinating study of human life. It startled the nation to hear a Negro advocating such a program after many decades of bitter complaint. It startled and won the applause of the South. It interested and won the admiration of the North. And after a confused murmur of protest, it silenced if it did not convert the Negroes themselves. To gain the sympathy and cooperation of the various elements comprising the white South was Mr. Washington's first task, and this at the time Tuskegee was founded seemed for a black man well nigh impossible. And yet 10 years later it was done in the word spoken at Atlanta. In all things purely social, we can be as separate as the five fingers and yet one as the hand in all things essential to mutual progress. This Atlanta Compromise is by all odds the most notable thing in Mr. Washington's career. The South interpreted in different ways. The radicals received it as a complete surrender of the demand of civil and political equality. The conservatives as a generously conceived working basis for mutual understanding. So both approved it, and today its author is certainly the most distinguished Southerner since Jefferson Davis, and the one with the largest personal following.
So yeah, like we said, this particular chapter, or the whole book really,
Mm-hmm.
is about uh, you could say debating and refuting a lot of the points of the Atlanta Compromise. And you could say that the first point of the Atlanta Compromise, or the first,
Mm-hmm.
or the crux of it, because the thing that kind of gave the South, you could say, a blank slate, or another way of ignoring the complaints and or plight
Right.
of a lot of its people was, in all things purely social, we can be as separate as the five fingers and yet one as the hand in all things essential to mutual progress.
Mm-hmm.
You know, which, like he said, gave a lot of the South, or a lot of uh,
Southerners. Mm-hmm.
opponents to black people's civil rights and progress, gave them a lot of ammunition, or gave them free reign to ignore what was happening. Because, like I said, a lot of people took it a lot of different ways, but all of it was used as an excuse to undermine and or ignore, a lot of the troubles in the black community at the
Mm-hmm.
time.
And the demands that they were making to be, treated as equals,
And
to have civil rights,
yeah,
to be able to fully participate and partake in in this
Yeah,
new reality
and
that's
it became a lot. It became what it is today,
yes.
where racism and at least very systemic racism and our role in society is seen as a personal failing, and that you know the avenues are there for you to get out of it. You just haven't taken advantage of those avenues, and that you can't blame racism and all that stuff. You can't blame the system.
Hmm.
It's you and your responsibility, and that's what you ought to be doing instead of complaining about the white man, right? And so it kind of allowed for, like I said, a lot of the political opponents to this situation to wash their hands clean of it and just say it's your problem, it's your
Hmm.
responsibility.
Yeah, you're just not working hard enough, and you're not saving your money or whatever. Yeah.
Hmm.
Next to this achievement comes Mr. Washington's work in gaining place and consideration in the North. Others less shrewd and tactful had formerly essayed to sit on these two stools and have fallen between them. But as Mr. Washington knew the heart of the South from birth and training, so by singular insight he intuitively grasped the spirit of the age which was dominating the North. And so thoroughly did he learn the speech and thought of triumphant commercialism and the ideas of material prosperity, that the picture of a lone black boy poring over a French grammar amid the weeds and dirt of a neglected home soon seemed to him the acme of absurdities. One wonders what Socrates and St. Francis of Assisi would say to this. And yet, this very singleness of vision and thorough oneness with his age is a mark of the successful man. It is as though nature must needs make men narrow in order to give them force. So Mr. Washington's cult has gained unquestioning followers. His work was wonderfully prospered. His friends are legions, and his enemies are confounded. Today he stands as as the one recognized spokesman of his 10 million fellows, and one of the most notable figures in a nation of 70 millions. One hesitates therefore to criticize a life which, beginning with so little, has done so much. And yet the time is come when one may speak in all sincerity and utter courtesy of the mistakes and shortcomings of Mr. Washington's career, as well as his triumphs, without being thought captious or envious, and without forgetting that it is easier to do ill than well in the world.
So it's like what we talked about in the forethought,
Mm-hmm.
that because there's a lot of consideration given to Mr. to Booker T. Washington.
Right,
Like he said, he's like we said before, he's not speaking from a place of malice.
right.
He doesn't consider Booker T. Washington
His enemy.
an enemy,
Right.
and not his responsibility to tear him down.
Mm-hmm.
That's not what he's trying to do here. What he's trying to do is
Right.
criticize this man and criticize his work in a way that is constructive
Mm-hmm.
to the aims and goals of the black community.
Right.
You know, and I do like how early on he did call Booker T. Washington's followers a cult. You know, and another cult of personality who
Mm-hmm.
kind of rallied behind the
Mm-hmm.
image and or projection of this one man,
Right.
which is something we've talked about many times before. That Booker T. Washington, in his time, became the face
Right.
of Black America,
Mm-hmm.
and but it was a once again it was and no wonder like he was embraced by the North and South, because he was a paternalistic voice
Mm-hmm.
who did not come with understanding. Like he said, um, uh, that the picture of a lone black boy poring over a French grammar amid the weeds and dirt of a neglected home soon seemed to him the acme of absurdities.
Mm-hmm.
He couldn't understand this drive within us to reach beyond, that thing that was, our current
Mm-hmm.
circumstances. To Booker T. Washington, he looked at that and then, why aren't your priorities cutting the grass
Right.
and fixing up your house? Why are you poring over French grammar, this thing that you won't ever use.
Mm.
You know, he so that was his voice,
Mm-hmm.
a paternalistic one that
Mm-hmm.
said that, don't worry about these so-called higher educational aspirations that you have. Don't even worry about civil liberties at the time. Cut the grass,
Mm-hmm.
fix your house, stuff like that.
Right.
And like he said, it's not like his points are without
Merit.
merit,
Mm-hmm.
or that that Booker T. Washington is speaking from a place of malice. And, that's not where any of this is coming from.
Mm-hmm.
No matter how the North and South may want to take his message,
Right.
That's not where Booker T. Washington is
That's
coming
right.
from. You
Right.
know,
The criticism that has hitherto met Mr. Washington has not always been of this broad character. In the South, especially, he had to walk warily to avoid the harshest judgment, and naturally so, for he is dealing with the one subject of deepest sensitiveness to that section. Twice. Once, when at a Chicago celebration of the Spanish American War, he alluded to the color prejudice that is eating away the vitals of the South. And once, when he dined with President Roosevelt, has the resulting Southern criticism been violent enough to threaten seriously his popularity. In the North, the feeling has several times forced itself into words that Mr. Washington's counsel of submission overlooked certain elements of true manhood, and that his educational program was unnecessarily narrow. Usually, however, such criticism has not found open expression, although, too, the spiritual sons of the abolitionists have not been prepared to acknowledge that the schools founded before Tuskegee by men of broad ideals and self-sacrificing spirit were wholly failures or worthy of ridicule. While then, criticized, while then criticism has public opinion of the land.
has not failed.
I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm.
While this criticism has not failed to follow Mr. Washington, yet the prevailing public opinion of the land has been but too willing to deliver the solution of a wearisome problem into his hands and say, if that is all you and your race ask, take it.
Mm-hmm.
I can't believe I blundered like that.
That's fine.
Okay.
All the lines are, they kind of run together.
Yeah. And so what we have here is that folks are like, well, if you're not making any demands,
Or that the demands that you're making
you're
are
making
so insubstantial
so
to the greater whole, then yeah,
yeah,
sure.
sure. You know, there's no need. There's no need for us to fuss and fight here.
Mm-hmm.
Why have our white sons and daughters,
Mm-hmm.
to partake in any of this if you're not asking anything of them? Well, what you're asking of them is not requiring anything of them.
Yeah, it's not actually challenging the
Right.
status quo. Like
Mm-hmm.
he said, it is a doctrine of submission,
Right.
and really
Yes.
that's what it is.
Mm-hmm.
Is that don't worry about actually challenging the system.
Mm-hmm.
Don't worry about challenging these status quos. Don't worry about expanding, your horizons.
Mm-hmm.
Just, occupy that relegated space,
Mm-hmm.
and do your best there.
Right.
Because from there, you can achieve the American dream. You don't
Yeah.
have to, challenge the status quo. You don't have to challenge these things. Perhaps they'll be fixed in time. Perhaps like it's not like he doesn't acknowledge the prejudice and the brutality
Mm-hmm.
that black people have to face. It's like he said before, eating away the vitals of the South. That's Booker T. Washington's
Right.
words.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not like he doesn't know about these things. It's not like he doesn't acknowledge them. But he thinks that maybe a more indirect approach to battling these social ills may be a bit more constructive.
Yeah. And that, you know, we could come together just for the mutual progress.
For the mutual progress, yes.
Yeah.
That
But
black people's progress are black people's responsibility.
ability, right.
You know.
Okay, yeah.
Yes.
Among his own people, however, Mr. Washington has encountered the strongest and most lasting opposition, amounting at times to bitterness, and even today continuing strong and insistent, even though largely silenced in outward expression by the public opinions of the nation. Some of this opposition is, of course, mere envy, the disappointment of displaced demagogues, and the spite of narrow minds. But aside from this, there is among educated and thoughtful colored men in all parts of the land a feeling of deep regret, sorrow, and apprehension at the wide currency and ascendancy which some of Mr. Washington's theories have gained. These same men admire his sincerity of purpose and are willing to forgive much to honest endeavor, which is doing something worth the doing. They cooperate with Mr. Washington as far as they conscientiously can. And indeed, it is so ordinary tribute to this man's tact and power that, steering as he must between so many diverse interests and opinions, he so largely retains the respect of all. But the hushing of the criticism of of honest opponents is a dangerous thing. It leads some of the best of the critics to unfortunate silence and paralysis of effort, and others to burst into speech so passionately and intemperatively as to lose listeners. Honest and earnest criticism from those whose interests are most nearly touched, criticism of writers by readers, of government by those governed, of leaders by those led. This is the soul of democracy and the safeguard of modern society. If the best of the American Negroes receive by outer pressure a leader whom they had not recognized before, manifestly there is here a certain palatable gain. Yet there is also irreparable loss, a loss of that peculiarly valuable education which a group receives when by search and criticism it finds and commissions its own leaders. The way in which this is done is at once the most elementary and the nicest problem of social growth. History is but the record of such group leadership, and yet how infinitely changeful is its type and character. And of all types and kinds, what can be more instructive than the leadership of a group within a group? That curious double movement where real progress may be negative and actual advance be relative retrogression. All this is the social student's inspiration and despair.
Mm. I read that this particular part, and it just reminds me, at least to my mind, it
Mm-hmm.
brings up images of Barack Obama
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
on how a lot of us were like we didn't know who this man was
Right.
before he got on that national stage,
Mm-hmm.
and it was like a leader had been chosen for
Right.
us, which led to this, like he said, this double movement, where the movement of the people inside of that group kind of took away from the movement of the group as a whole, and the
Mm-hmm.
movement of the group as a whole took away from the movement of that subset of people inside.
Mm-hmm.
And it led to a retrogression, it led to a backwards motion,
Mm-hmm.
as nothing could actually move forward because there was this dissonance,
Mm-hmm.
as we've said many times before, this dissonance between the people and those meant to lead them. There was something got lost in translation
Mm-hmm.
because a leader was chosen for them.
Mm-hmm.
You know, whether it be intentional or unintentional. That's the circumstances that we found ourselves in. Back then, at least to my mind, and this is the circumstance that W.E.B. Du Bois
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of the black people of his day
Right.
find themselves in.
Mm-hmm. Now in the past, the American Negro has instructive experience in the choosing of group leaders, founding thus a peculiar dynasty which in the light of present conditions is worthwhile studying. When sticks and stones and beasts form the sole environment of a people, their attitude is largely one of determined opposition to and conquest of natural forces. But when to earth and brute is added an environment of men and ideas, then the attitude of the imprisoned group may take three main forms: a feeling of revolt and revenge, an attempt to adjust all thought and action to the will of the greater group, or, finally, a determined effort at self realization and self development despite environing opinions. The influence of all of these attitudes at various times can be traced in the history of the American Negro and in the evolution of his successive leaders.
Yeah,
I mean, that's
that's
pretty much self explanatory.
that. Because this one chapter, not one chapter, this
Mm-hmm.
paragraph right here, I think is very illuminating
Mm-hmm.
on why our predicament is so long lasting. Because, like you said, if we were merely dealing with, you know, the brutality of the natural world, and if we were dealing with natural forces here, then yeah, it would be easy to oppose and conquer these things. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, that's where, community and civilization comes from, opposing and conquering the natural world to some extent, right? But like you said, when you add to that natural world men and ideas,
Mm-hmm.
this extra layer, then you create a new lane, a new byway where you're not actually opposing just the savagery of your world, but you are also existing in a world
Ideas.
of ideas,
Mm-hmm.
of dialogue,
Mm-hmm.
of philosophy. And then I said, those are two paradoxical things.
Mm-hmm.
You would think that these two things could not exist together, but they do.
Mm-hmm.
Because right now, you say our world is very savage. It is very brutal, but it is also very reasonable
Mm-hmm.
and philosophically robust. And you would think that in the world of madness and brutality and savagery, there'll be no space for
Right. For
any type
reason.
of
Right.
reason or philosophical leaning or
Mm-hmm.
thinking. But there is. And you would think that in the world of philosophical reasoning, that there would be no space for brutality and savagery.
And yet,
And yet there
it, right.
is. And I think that's one of the reasons why we're still here,
Mm-hmm.
why we're still, fighting and moving, to try to be a part of this system.
Mm-hmm.
Because yes, it is broken, like we've said many times before. Yes, it is broken. It is brutal. It is savage, but it's not beyond reason.
Mm-hmm.
Is not beyond reason. It's not like it's incapable of acknowledging what it is that we're going through and what it is that we want to attain. It's not incapable of doing these things. It is more than capable. We've seen it do before, so we become so so enamored, you could say, for lack of a better term,
Mm-hmm.
enamored with trying to force the reason out of the brokenness that we are confronted with.
I find that it's been, and when I say easier, just hear what I'm saying. It's easier to fight the beast, like the
Mm,
physical fight. That's, I'm gonna say, quote unquote, the easy part. The difficult part is the reasoning.
mm,
It is the dialogue. It is the ideas. Because what we are fighting today, and even for W.E.B. Bois and those back at the turn of the 20th century, is that not only are we fighting trying to preserve our physical bodies, okay?
mm-hmm,
We're also fighting against these ideas that are permeating, which is the idea of us
mm-hmm,
just being relegated to cutting the grass,
mm-hmm.
okay? That you're only fit for, the work of an ox, basically.
Yeah.
Fighting that idea has is the hardest part of this. That's why it's so disturbing, I guess, for W.E.B. Du Bois to even try to have this conversation, is
Mm-hmm.
because he's fighting this idea of what Booker T. Washington is had conveyed in his Atlanta Compromise,
I
that we are only fit for the work. That's the only, and that to even try to do something else, beyond, I guess, the work is absurd. So fighting, that idea is much, it's much harder to do. And we take it as being, being jealous, or that, well, or being envious, or those, and that's not what this is. But it's much harder to fight the idea, even though, yes, there is space for reasoning. There is that space for that, but it's harder to fight the the idea.
And I don't think Booker T. Washington is saying that black people are only good for cutting the grass. I don't think that's what he's saying. I think that's how you know a lot of people want to take it. Because it helps to reinforce that image that was already there
Mm-hmm.
of us. But I don't think that's what Booker T. Washington is saying, that we're only good for that space. I don't think that he's saying that we should not try to uh, uh, reach out of that space. You know, I think what he's saying is that our first priority should be, perfecting the space that we're in. It's not that we can't get out of it, or we shouldn't strive to get out of it, but existing in our current position as we are is should be our first priority.
And we are physically in that space
Yeah,
because of the idea.
yeah.
And so,
We know, so we know
right,
how we
right.
know how it fails. We
Mm-hmm.
know that that you can't say that we need to fix our space, our living.
Mm-hmm.
That we need to be here, learn
Right.
trade jobs and stuff like that, and not reach beyond, because as if these things are mutually exclusive.
Exclusive, right. Mm-hmm.
You know, those things go hand in hand. You can't, and it's like, and it's the same thing like we talked about before. With when Thomas Jefferson saw slaves, and he would say that some slaves were lazy.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't very enterprising. And it's like, yeah, obviously, you're not going to get the best
Mm-hmm.
out of a people when they are forced into that position.
Right.
He wasn't able to see, or
Right.
he ignored that that is an act of rebellion.
Mm-hmm.
That when you are forced to occupy that space, that no, you're not going to get this outpouring of energy,
Right.
and we're all going to just be given our very best. We're
Mm-hmm.
forced to no, you're not going to get that.
Right.
You're not going to get that. And it's the same thing now.
Right.
Why don't you just cut the grass? Why don't you just do this? Why don't you just focus on, dealing on, fixing your problems as they present themselves right there?
Mm-hmm.
Fix up, yeah, do this. Focus on trade jobs. Focus on what you can do. You know, like, no, obviously that's not, because we're forced to exist in
That
this
space,
space.
right.
Here's the thing: you can't say that we have a choice when we literally don't have a choice, when we're not given the opportunity
Mm-hmm.
to expand out of it. It's say if we were given all of those options, if we were given all of those
Mm-hmm.
options, then yeah, it would be our responsibility to cut the grass and
Right.
do all that stuff. But we aren't.
Mm-hmm.
Our only option is to cut
Cut
the
the grass,
grass.
right. So we're
So no, we
right.
won't cut the
The grass,
grass
right. Right.
because we want more.
Mm-hmm.
Our main struggle is to try to get out of that, relegated space.
Mm-hmm.
Not trying to exist in it, not trying to perfect it, not
Right.
trying to clean it up. If we're forced to occupy this space, then yes, this is what that looks like.
Mm-hmm.
You know, but I don't think that Booker T. Washington is saying that this is
Uh-huh.
all we're good for. I think
Mm-hmm.
that that's the way that people want to take it.
Mm-hmm.
Especially the white Southerners who
Mm-hmm.
already had that image to
Right.
begin with.
Mm-hmm.
But I think, like he said, he sees these things as mutually exclusive.
Mm-hmm.
That you can't go for higher educational aspirations
And cut the grass.
and cut the
Yeah.
grass.
Before 1750, while the fire of African freedom still burned in the veins of the slaves, there was in all leadership, or attempted leadership, but the one motive of revolt and revenge, typified by the terrible Maroons, the Danish blacks, the Cato or Stono, and veiling all the Americans in fear of insurrection. The liberalizing tendencies of the latter half of the 18th century brought, along with kindlier relations between black and white, thoughts of ultimate adjustment and assimilation. Such aspirations was especially voiced in the earnest songs of Phyllis, in the martyrdom of Atticus, the fighting of Salem and Poor, the intellectual accomplishment of Banneker and, and Durham, and the political demands of the Coffees. Stern financial and social stress after the war cooled much of the previous humanitarian order. The disappointment and impatience of the Negroes at the persistence of slavery and serfdom voiced itself in two movements. The slaves in the South, aroused undoubtedly by vague rumors of the Haitian revolt, made three fierce attempts at insurrection: in 1800 under Gabriel in Virginia, in 1822 under Vesey in Carolina, and in 1831 again in Virginia under the terrible Nat Turner.
Yeah, so a lot of these events, like we went over
Right.
the homes, like I know about Vesey,
Mm-hmm.
right, and how he tried to do a coup
Mm-hmm.
in what is it in Carolina,
Uh-huh.
and there was kind of a lot of the tenor being played here because of the Haitian
Mm-hmm.
Revolution.
Yeah, because all this is happening because I think it's like 1800, 1804. I think is when that time. So
Mm-hmm.
this is right in the midst, and we know about just because we talked about the revolt in Louisiana. I mean, so
Yeah,
you had so many. He mentions three, but there was so many. All of this is happening at the same time,
yeah.
and of course, the thing that you want to do. If you want to get from under this boot, you got to stop the person who got the boot on you. So that's
But
right,
like you said,
right.
it there's a give and take in all of
Mm-hmm.
these
Right,
particular things
right.
that it became easier
Mm-hmm.
for white people to cling to their fears.
Right,
They're like, oh, because the black man's going to come for you. He's going to
right,
come for you and your family and
right.
stuff like that.
You're gonna fight back, and
And
whatever. Mm-hmm.
it became to they it's easier to, like I said, to cling to those fears in that type of environment, and that's what a lot of people did. And everything kind of, you can see like this give and take, this like this forward and backward movement. Like you talked about this intellectual, like I said, reasoning with the philosophical side and
Mm-hmm.
having to fight and to resist the savagery,
Right.
of the world that we're living in. So
Mm-hmm.
you see that, like you talked about, all of these revolts, but you
Right.
also talk about the educational pursuits
Mm-hmm.
that, and all of these things detract from one another
Mm-hmm.
in a sense. So you see like this stagnation that we all existed in until the Civil War.
Right. In the free states, on the other hand, a new and curious attempt at self-development was made. In Philadelphia and New York, color prescriptions led to a withdrawal of Negro communicants from white churches and the formation of a peculiar social religious institution among the Negroes known as the African Church, an organization still living and controlling in its various branches over a million of men. Walker's wild appeal against the trend of the times showed how the world was changing after the coming of the cotton gin. By 1830, slavery seemed hopelessly fastened on the South, and the slaves thoroughly cowed into submission. The free Negroes of the North, inspired by the mulatto immigrants from the West Indies, began to change the basis of their demands. They recognized the slavery of slaves, but insisted that they themselves were freemen, and sought assimilation and amalgamation with the nation on the same terms with other men. Thus, Fortune and Purvis of Philadelphia, Shide of Wilmington, Du Bois of New Haven, Barbados of Boston, and others strove singly and together as men. They said, not as slaves, as people of color, not as Negroes. The trend of the times, however, refused them recognition, save in individual and exceptional cases, considered them as one with all the despised blacks, and they soon found themselves striving to keep even the rights they formerly had of voting and working and moving as freemen. Schemers of, of migration and colonization arose among them, but they but
Mhm.
these they refused to entertain, and they eventually turned to the abolition movement as a final refuge. It was hot and heavy. As you can, it's basically what's
A
happening
lot
here.
of people are having a lot of responses,
Mm-hmm.
and like I said, it's all kind of like I said, this weird stagnation going on
Hmm.
as each particular ideal kind of nothing is ever there's never nothing's really going together.
Right.
Everything's moving in opposition
Listen.
to each
Hmm.
other. There's no set movement,
Right.
no set direction. Not until, like you said,
Right.
you kind of rested on
Right.
abolition, which
Right.
kind of became the de facto leading ideal, kind
Hmm.
of by process of elimination.
Hmm.
It was the last thing on the list.
Right.
You know,
Here, led by Reedman, Neal, Wells Brown, and Douglas, a new period of self assertion and self development dawned. To be sure, ultimate freedom and assimilation was the ideal before the leaders, but the assertion of the manhood rights of the Negro by himself was the main reliance. And John Brown's raid was the extreme of this logic. After the war and emancipation, the great form of Frederick Douglass, the greatest of American Negro leaders, still led the host. Self assertion, especially in political lines, was the main program. And behind Douglass came Eliot, Bruce, and Langston, and the Reconstruction politicians. And less conspicuous, but of greater social significance, Alexander Cromwell and Bishop Daniel Payne. Then came the Revolution of 1876, the suppression of the Negro votes, the changing and shifting of ideas, and the seeking of new lights in the great night. Douglass, in his old age, still bravely stood for the ideals of his early manhood, ultimate assimilation through self assertion, and on no other terms. For a time, Price arose as a new leader, destined, it seemed, not to give up, but to restate the old ideals in a form less repugnant to the white South. But he passed away in his prime. Then came the new leader. Nearly all of the former ones had become leaders by the silent suffrage of their fellows, had sought to lead their own people alone, and were usually, save Douglass, little known outside their race. But Booker T. Washington arose as essentially the leader not of one race but of two, a compromiser between the South, the North, and the Negro. Naturally, the Negroes resented, at first bitterly, signs of compromise which surrendered their civil and political rights, even though this was to be exchanged for larger chances of economic development. The rich and dominating North, however, was not only weary of the race problem, but was investing largely in Southern enterprises and welcomed any method of peaceful cooperation. Thus, by national opinion, the Negroes began to recognize Mr. Washington's leadership, and the voice of criticism was hushed. Mr. Washington represents in Negro thought the old attitude of adjustment and submission, but adjustment at such a peculiar time as to make his program unique. This is an age of unusual economic development, and Mr. Washington's program naturally takes an economic cast, becoming a gospel of work and money to such an extent as apparently almost completely to overshadow the higher aims of life. Moreover, this is an age when the more advanced races are coming in closer contact with the less developed races, and the race feeling is therefore intensified. And Mr. Washington's program practically accepts the alleged inferiority of the Negro races. Again, in our own land, the reaction from the sentiment of wartime has given impetus to race prejudice against Negroes, and Mr. Washington withdraws many of the high demands of Negroes as men and American citizens. In other periods of intensified prejudice, all the Negroes' tendency to self assertion has been called forth. At this period, a policy of submission is advocated. In the history of nearly all other races and peoples, the doctrine preached at such cries has been that manly self respect is worth more than lands and houses, and that a people who voluntarily surrender such respect or cease striving for it are not worth civilizing.
mhm. So yeah, like you said, this idea, like I said, of adjustment and submission is not a new one. It has been around for a very long time, especially when you're dealing with such harsh opposition,
Mm-hmm.
to put it lightly. But the fact that this message was coming, like I said, outside of slavery,
Mm-hmm.
it was coming during, during emancipation when people were, striving
Mm-hmm.
for that, civil representation and for their civil rights and all these things. That this message of adjustment and submission, was coming then. That you give up your striving for these things at the present moment, for greater economic benefit. You know, that you may be able to create more a more stable economic foundation for yourself if you were to like adjust and submit. And even though, like you said, at no people, no race has ever done that. No
Right.
race has ever prioritized economic benefit over civil liberties. That
Over
has
being over just being a man. Like he even says, like in the period of policy and submission, okay, in the history of nearly all other races and peoples, the doctrine of priests and such cries has been that manly self-respect is worth more than lands and houses, and that a people who voluntarily surrender such respect or seek striving for it are not worth civilizing. What kind of man are you? And how do you expect and other people, or how do you expect anybody to respect you when you're if you're doing something? No man does this. No person, no people, no one does this. And to expect us to adjust and submit just so we can get some money. You did not. The idea. You're not even a man. No. No. I mean, this is. You're not worth it. It's just not worth it. And that's how, well, yeah, you know.
like that that mentality is not new.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure it's not one that, we've never heard of even at this particular
Mm-hmm.
moment in time.
Yep, yep.
But but like I said, it was unique at its time because it seemed so
Outrageous,
ridiculous.
yeah.
It seems so ridiculous,
Right.
especially like let's say at the outset of like emancipation, like right out of
And
slavery,
yeah, right. Because
Reconstruction.
you're
We're
like,
at
what?
this very formative period.
Right.
In time, you have this man just saying, "Don't strive for those things.
Yeah.
Just focus on any type of economic benefit that is afforded you, and just do that." And it's like, and like he said, that's not how this works. You can't prioritize economic benefit over civil liberties because if you don't have the civil liberties to truly, do something constructive with those economic benefits, then you have nothing. You have nothing, and it's like it seems so backwards, but it caught on at a very, like I said, at a very formative time in our history. And because, like you said, it became a gospel of work and money. Because like profit wasn't a thing that we as a community were very used to, and that very used to getting paid for our work at that time. So the idea of just focusing on that can you can understand how that could catch fire at a moment like that, especially when it's so hard and it's so detrimental to your well-being, to your life, to try to strive for anything outside of that. So you can understand how a message like that could catch on at such a time, but it is backwards. It is like it's ridiculous. How can you possibly prioritize economic benefit when you don't have the civil liberties to make that benefit into something long lasting or something substantial? You can't really translate it into anything. So at that point, it's not an economic benefit. It's just economic access. And it's not really anything of any substance, of any use. Because if the goal is trying to attain, your civil liberties, of trying to obtain your rights, your unalienable rights, if that's the whole point of what we're doing, then there is no, prioritize your job first.
Right.
No, that's not how this works. You know, you would think that those things would come after, or all these things are happening at the same time, but you wouldn't prioritize that before anything else because, like I said, it's detrimental to to just to your sense of self worth, to your sense of
Yes.
self respect. Like
Yeah.
how, but yeah,
Yeah. In answer to this, it has been claimed that the Negro can survive only through submission. Mr. Washington distinctly asks that black people give up, at least for the present, three things. First, political power. Second, insistence on civil rights. Third, higher education of Negro youth. And concentrate all their energies on industrial education, the accumulation of wealth, and the conciliation of the South. This policy has been courageously and insistently advocated for over 15 years and has been triumphant for perhaps 10 years. As a result of this tender of the palm branch, what has been the return? In these years, three have occurred. One, the, dis- the disfranchisement of the Negro. Two, the legal creation of a distinct status of civil inferiority for the Negro. Three, the steady withdrawal of aid from institutions for the higher training of the Negro. Yeah, that's that mutual progress you think, huh?
who would think that if you don't, if you're not attaining for civil liberty and representation in the system, that you won't get it?
Right. Wow.
Who would have thought?
Shocker. These movements are not, to be sure, direct results of Mr. Washington's teaching, but his propaganda has, without a shadow of a doubt, helped a speedier accomplishment. The question then comes, is it possible and probable that 9 million of men can make effective progress in economic lines if they are deprived of political rights, made a servile caste, and allowed only the most meager chance for developing their exceptional men? If history and reason give any distinct answer to these questions, it is an emphatic no. And Mr. Washington thus faced the triple paradox of his career. Number one, he is striving nobly to make Negro artisan businessmen and property owners, but it is utterly impossible under modern competitive methods for working men and property owners to defend their rights and exist without the right of suffrage. Two, he insists on thrift and self respect, but at the same time counsels a silent submission to civic inferiority such as is bound to sap the manhood of any race in the long run. Three, he advocates common school and industrial training and depreciates institutions of higher learning. But neither the Negro common schools nor Tuskegee itself could remain open a day were it not for the teachers trained in Negro colleges or trained by their graduates. This triple paradox in Mr. Washington's position is the object of criticism by two classes of colored Americans. One class is spiritually ascended from Toussaint the Savior through Gabriel, Vesey, and Turner, and they represent the attitude of revolt and revenge. They hate the white South blindly and distrust the white race generally. And so far as they agree on definite action, think that the Negro's only hope lies in immigration beyond the borders of the United States. And yet, by the irony of fate, nothing has more effectually made this program seem hopeless than the recent course of the United States towards weaker and darker peoples in the West Indies, Hawaii, and the Philippines. And for where in the world may we go and be safe from lying and brute force? The other class of Negroes who cannot agree with Mr. Washington has hitherto said little aloud. They deprecate the sight of scattered counsels, of internal disagreement, and especially they dislike making their just criticism of a useful and earnest man an excuse for a general discharge of venom from small minded opponents. Nevertheless, the questions involved are so fundamental and serious that it's difficult to see how men like the Grimke's, Kelly Miller, W.E.B, and other representatives of the group can much longer be silent. Such men feel in conscience bound to ask of this nation three things. One, the right to vote. Two, civic equality. Three, the education of youth according to ability. They acknowledge Mr. Washington's invaluable service in counseling patience and courtesy in such demands. They do not ask that ignorant black men vote when ignorant whites are debarred, or that any reasonable restrictions in the suffrage should not be applied. They know that the low social level of the mass of the race is responsible for much discrimination against it. But they also know, and the nation knows, that relentless color prejudice is more often a cause than a result of the Negro's degradation. They seek the abatement of this relic of barbarism, and not its systematic encouragement and pampering by all agencies of social power from the Associated Press to the Church of Christ. They advocate with Mr. Washington a broad system of Negro common schools supplemented by thorough industrial training. But they are surprised that a man of Mr. Washington's insight cannot see that no such educational system ever has rested or can rest on, on any other basis than that of the well equipped college and university. And they insist that there is a demand for a few such institutions throughout the South to train the best of the Negro youth as teachers, professional men, and leaders. This group of men honor Mr. Washington for his attitude of conciliation towards the white South. They accept the Atlanta Compromise in its broadest interpretation. They recognize with him many signs of promise, many men of high purpose and fair judgment in this section. They know that no easy task has been laid upon a region already tottering under heavy burdens. But, nevertheless, they insist that the way to truth and right lies in the straightforward honesty, not in the indiscriminate flattery, in praising those of the South who do well and criticizing uncompromisingly those who do ill, and taking advantage of the opportunities at hand and urging their fellows to do the same. But at the same time, in remembering that only a firm adherence to their higher ideals and aspirations will ever keep those ideals within the realms of possibility. They do not expect that the free right to vote, to enjoy civil rights, and to be educated will come in a moment. They do not expect to see the bias and prejudice of years disappear at the blast of a trumpet. To gain their reasonable rights is not,
But
but they are absolutely certain that the way for a people to gain their reasonable rights is not by voluntarily throwing them away and insisting that they do not want them. That the way for a people to gain respect is not by continually belittling and ridiculing themselves. That, on the contrary, Negroes must insist continually, in season and in out of season, that voting is necessary to modern manhood, that color discrimination is barbarism, and that black boys need education as well as white boys.
mm,
In failing thus to state plainly and unequivocally the legitimate demands of their people, even at the cost of opposing an honored leader, the thinking classes of American Negroes will shirk a heavy responsibility, a responsibility to themselves, a responsibility to the struggling masses, a responsibility to the darker races of men whose future depends so largely on this American experiment, but especially a responsibility to this nation, this common fatherland. It is wrong to encourage a man or a people in evil doing. It is wrong to aid and abet a national crime simply because it is unpopular not to do so. The growing spirit of kindliness and reconciliation between the North and South after the frightful difference of a generation ago ought to be a source of deep congratulation to all, and especially to those whose mistreatment caused the war. But if that reconciliation is to be marked by the industrial slavery and civic death of those same black men, with permanent legislation into a position of inferiority, then those black men, if they are really men, are called upon by every consideration of patriotism and loyalty to oppose such a course by all civilized methods, even though such opposition involves disagreement with Mr. Booker T. Washington. We have no right to sit silently by while the inedible seeds are sown for a harvest of disaster to our children, black and white.
because the civil rights movement was very far off so this is during the time during the imposition of Jim Crow.
Mm-hmm.
All of these things are happening right now, and it seems like it's like the creation of this permanent civic inferiority, trying to reinforce that image. And it's like these things are happening right now. How is it that anyone can say that we shouldn't, strive for our civil liberties because, like I said, it's unpopular to do so? And how is it that a lot of our leaders at the time feel so, bashful at actually calling this out? Because We don't want to undermine or detract away from the success of one man.
And how was it that this nation, because like he mentions, how is it that they're going to learn what happened was wrong if you're too busy?
If we aren't directing
If
the
we are
conversation,
right,
if we aren't saying it at every possible opportunity, if we aren't, showing it, if we aren't, like I said, the North and the South are coming together once again, they'll be able to reconcile, but without
mm-hmm.
actually facing
Right,
its sins.
yeah, what they did, right?
Like I said, the mistreatment of the black man is not, at the forefront of this conversation. It's being relegated to the background, like I said, even though it's the thing that caused the war. If we aren't able to center the conversation on our plight, on our struggle for freedom, on our push for representation, to attain our civil liberties, we won't get them. If black and if white people cannot see what it is that we face. If we, it's easy to ignore it. They exist in their own little world. So do we. But if we aren't pushing it, if we aren't saying it in every possible opportunity, what it is that we're dealing with, if we let the country forget, then we will be relegated once again, to this permanent civic inferiority.
And
And
here we are,
that's
right?
what we're existing in. That's what he's existing in at the time.
Right.
And that's what we're existing in now. This permanent civic inferiority because the country refuses to acknowledge what it has done, and its disastrous effects because they keep recentering the conversation around everything but racism.
Right.
And if we aren't pushing that, and if we aren't constantly bringing it back to that, then yeah, they're gonna constantly try because it comes at a personal cost to them.
Right.
So that's why they make it a personal failing of ours.
And
You're saying and pushing these things,
right.
and all the other leaders are failing to address this and criticize you for this. And it's all coming at a very steep cost to the black community as a whole and to the nation as a whole, because it's never going to be able to truly get over this if it can constantly ignore it.
First, it is the duty of black men to judge the South discriminatingly. The present generation of Southerners are not responsible for the past, and they should not be blindly hated or blamed for it. Furthermore, to no class is an indiscriminate endorsement of the recent course of the South towards Negro more nauseating than to the best thought of the South. The South is not solid. It is a land in the ferment of social change, wherein forces of all kinds are fighting for supremacy. And to praise the ill of the South is today perpetuating is just as wrong as to condemn the good. Discriminating and broad-minded criticism is what the South needs it for the sake of our own white sons and daughters, and for the assurance of robust, healthy mental and moral development. Maybe that's why y'all still crashing. We don't want critical race theory thought, but you need it. This country needs to face what has happened.
Everything needs to stop growing in opposition to each other. If it was, like I said, if this was a continuous dialogue, if this was, an actual conversation we were having to us, then we could, be growing toward a mutually beneficial future.
Right.
But the fact that you're ignoring what's happening, that you're ignoring the cost, you're ignoring the systems that you're existing in, means you're putting it on your children, you're putting it on your sons and daughters, and when they realize something, they're going to move away from you, away from your particular line of thinking. Instead of it all growing together, it's all moving in opposition to each other. And so now you're fighting the future, right? And the future is fighting itself. Everything's eating itself alive because we're working from this basis of don't ask, don't tell. just ignore it. Don't talk about it. And if it's a present thing in your life, then it's your responsibility and your responsibility alone to deal with it.
Right.
This is untenable.
Right.
It's impossible to actually do anything constructive from a social standpoint if we cannot admit what is happening. If the country cannot admit what is happening, white and black,
Mm-hmm.
if we cannot, like you said, if we just decrying everything as bad is as destructive as saying everything's okay.
Mm-hmm.
We have to look soberingly at those things that are moving us in a positive direction and are moving us in a negative direction. We need to be able to have this conversation. Like I said, nothing is solid. He said the South, I'll say everything, the
Right.
whole country.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing is solid. All of these forces are vying, to leave their imprint, and dictate the path on which we're going to be moving on.
Mm-hmm.
All of these things are happening at time and just telling us to shut up and just do your job and
Right.
don't worry about. That's not how this is. There's no way in the world. There's no way that we are going to do anything beneficial for the country, for
Sales.
ourselves.
Right.
There is no way that we're going to get to that place that we're trying to achieve, that we're trying to get to, if we have this sentiment of adjustment and submission,
Mm-hmm.
and if we're too scared, to call out our own, if we're too scared to criticize ourselves and recognize our own philosophical and social failings, if we aren't willing to have this true, if we aren't being honest,
Yeah.
if we're not being honest with ourselves. And that's what he's dealing with. And it's like, and I can just imagine how mind melting it was for W.E.B. Du Bois to be existing
Mm-hmm.
at that time and see the type of I can understand it now. I can understand it now because you can use the bathroom.
Mm-hmm.
There is no more, there is no more explicit civic inferiority. Everything's indirect at this point now,
Mm-hmm.
right? But slavery, like I said, was like a like a
you're one, like he said,
like,
you're one generation
yeah, not
removed.
even that.
You're not even that.
Like 22 years, like 22,
And you said,
23 years,
what are you
and
talking
you
about?
already saying this? Like, what in the
The
hell is
hell,
going on?
right? If for others to not criticize you, you know, because I don't even know why. Like, what are you doing? You know this is not right.
That misplaced sense of loyalty.
Loyalty. You know this is not right. You know this. It's still and then for someone to criticize, the only you come with that, oh, you just jealous. Ain't nobody who would be jealous of a man who tells you submit and adjust. Who's jealous of that? Why? You tell me the only thing, industrial training, as if we don't know how to do industrial work anyway. But okay, industrial training. Okay, who's going to train you? Don't you need universities for that? Who's going to come in and do it? There is no Tuskegee without intellectual, without higher education. There is no Tuskegee without it. Tuskegee is not an industrial school. What are you talking? Today, even the attitude of the Southern whites towards the black is not. So it's been assumed in
Oh,
all.
no, you missed first.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm
Yeah.
sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. First, it is a duty of black men to judge the South discriminately, to present generations of Southerners are not responsible for the past, and they should not be blindly hated or blamed for it. I thought I just read that. Furthermore, it is no class.
Oh yeah, you did.
I did read this. I just read this. That's not, I was right. I'm sorry.
Oh yeah, you were right.
Sorry. I'm sorry.
We got turned around.
Right, sorry.
Yeah, you were right. I was wrong.
No problem. No problem. No problem. Today, even the attitude of the Southern whites towards the blacks is not, as so many assume, in all cases the same. The ignorant Southerner hates the Negro. The working men fear his competition. The money makers wish to use him as laborer. Some of the educated see a menace in his upward development, while others, usually the sons of the masters, wish to help him to rise. National opinion has enabled this last class to maintain the Negro common schools and to protect the Negro partially in property, life, and limb. Through the pressure of the moneymakers, the Negro is in danger of being reduced to semi-slavery, especially in the country districts. The working men and those of the educated who fear the Negro have united to disfranchise him, and some have urged his deportation, while the passion of the ignorant are easily aroused to lynch and abuse any black man. To praise this intricate world of thought and prejudice is nonsense. To invade indiscriminately against the South is unjust. But to use the same breath in praising Governor Ike, exposing Senator Morgan, arguing with Mr. Thomas Nelson Page, and denouncing Senator Ben Tillman is not only sane, but the imperative duty of thinking black men. It would be unjust to Mr. Washington not to acknowledge that in several instances he has opposed movements in the South which were unjust to the Negroes. He sent memorials to the Louisiana and Alabama constitutional conventions. He has spoken against lynching, and in other ways has openly or silently set his influence against sinister schemes and unfortunate happenings. Notwithstanding this, it is equally true to assert that on the whole, the distinct impression left by Mr. Washington's propaganda is, first, that the South is justified in its present attitude towards the Negro because of the Negro's degradation. Secondly, that the prime cause of the Negro's failure to rise more quickly is his wrong education in the past. And thirdly, that his future rise depends primarily on his own efforts. Each of these propositions is a dangerous half truth. The supplementary truth must never be lost sight of. First, slavery and race prejudice are potent, if not sufficient, causes for the Negro's position. Second, industrial and common school training were necessarily slow in planting because they had to wait the black teachers trained by higher institutions. It being extremely doubtful if any essentially different development was possible, and certainly a Tuskegee was unthinkable before 1880. And third, while it is a great truth to say that the Negro must strive and strives mightily to help himself, it is equally true that unless his striving be not simply seconded, but rather aroused and encouraged by the initiative of the richer and wiser environing group, he cannot hope for great success. In his failure to realize and impress this last point, Mr. Washington is especially to be criticized. His doctrine has tended to make the whites, North and South, shift the burden of the Negro problem to the Negro shoulders and stand aside as critical and rather pessimistic spectators, when in fact the burden belongs to the nation, and the hands of none of us are clean if we bend not our energies to righting these great wrongs. The South ought to be led by candid and honest criticism to assert her better self and to do her full duty to the race she has cruelly wronged and is still wronging. The North, her co-partner in guilt, cannot salve her conscience by plastering it with gold. We cannot settle this problem by diplomacy or suaveness, by policy alone. If worst comes to worst, can the moral fiber of this country survive the slow throttling and murder of 9 millions of men? The black men of America have a duty to perform, a duty to stern and delicate, a duty stern and delicate, a forward movement to oppose a part of the work of their greatest leader. So far as Mr. Washington preaches thrift, patience, and industrial training for the masses, he must hold up his hands. We must hold up his hands and strive with him, rejoicing in his honors and glorying in the strength of this Joshua called of God and a man to lead the headless host. But so far as Mr. Washington apologies for injustices, North or South, does not rightly value the privilege and duty of voting, belittles the emasculating effects of caste distinctions, and opposes the higher training and ambitions of our brighter minds. So far as he, the South, or the nation does this, we must unceasingly and firmly oppose them. By every civilized and peaceful method, we must strive for the rights which the world accords to men, clinging unwaveringly to those great words which the sons of the fathers would fain forget. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Mm.
I don't know what else. I mean, look, we cannot submit our submit ourselves to advancement
For advancement.
for advancement. That's not how this is going to work. You have a right as a man to be full participants in this world. And your submission to another's system and another's groups is not
Sufficient.
is not sufficient. And to propagate that type of idea is utterly ridiculous. And
And it
for
is corrosive
yes,
to any substantial and sustained effort that we may be able to galvanize. When you
it's yeah.
when you say that, well, we because like I said, you prioritize property over life. You're prioritizing the safety and peace of the whole, over the strivings of one particular group, because it's easier for the nation as a whole to just ignore this problem.
And to say that the reason why we're in the position that we're in is simply because, we weren't educated enough, we're not working hard enough, or whatever. This is it's ridiculous. That's the all that it's utterly insane. And for a W.E.B. Du Bois, or for anyone, but particularly because we're for him to be as critical as he was of Booker T. Washington, and the only thing that you can say, well, is just because he's envious. Are you insane? Are you that you're not trying to engage the way that I would say that a W.E.B. Du Bois was trying to engage in this. At no time, like I said, like mentioned, I think it's in the one of in the previous episodes that Booker T. Washington is not W.E.B. Du Bois's enemy, or W.E. Du Bois did not make Booker T. Washington an enemy of him or enemy. Period. It's just that looking at what he is
He
stressing.
felt a duty,
Yes.
a duty to his people, to himself, and to Booker T. Washington
Mm-hmm.
to criticize this man's particular program, his propaganda.
Mm-hmm.
He felt it was a need of national importance, because if this particular ideal takes root, then it makes it impossible. I repeat, and I'm going to, there's no ifs, ands, or buts
What's
about
about
it.
this, right?
It makes it impossible to be able to actually stand as an equal in this system. It makes it utterly, absolutely impossible. There is no way in Booker T. Washington's ideal and program of what this is supposed to be, there is no way for us to gain our civil liberties and our civil rights. No way.
And you won't be able to protect your accumulated wealth because you have no rights.
Yeah, like I'm saying,
Like this is
it's not a benefit,
right,
if you don't have the civil freedoms to be able to use that and
right,
put that in place. Like I said, it's not a benefit. It's just access. You're just there.
So yeah.
So in conclusion, Booker T. Washington and the others
Mm-hmm.
are not, W.E.B. Du Bois's enemies. He's not their enemies.
Mm-hmm.
But having an honest discussion, an honest and open discussion about what is happening, especially during his time, but
Mm-hmm.
at any time, about what is happening in the country, what's happening in the South, in the North, and the way things are going. Being able to openly and honestly say that this is wrong, that we need to do something else, and that the message needs to be adjusted are of the utmost importance.
Mm-hmm.
It cannot be, overstated the atmosphere in which these men, these people were existing in. That it was very hot, it was very dangerous
Mm-hmm.
for any, black person, but especially those who felt the need to, to speak, on any type of stage. It's very dangerous for these people, but it's also a very formative time. And you feel the sense of urgency in W.E.B. Du Bois's writings on we have to get this right. We have to get this right. Because if we don't, you get the creation of permanent civic inferiority. And no one can say that he's wrong because that's where we are right now, still existing in that relegated space,
Mm-hmm.
in that civic inferiority, not truly being afforded all the rights and opportunities that we're supposed to be afforded, whether directly or indirectly, because it's getting a bit more direct these days.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like it is very, very, very important that we have this conversation in an open and honest way,
Mm-hmm.
to be able to honestly criticize ourselves and our systems, and to be able to say that those things that are bad, and that those things that are good. It's like it is like in 1984 when the main character says that as long as I know that 2 plus 2 equals 4, as long as I know this, as long as I have that, as long as the system cannot rob me of my innate sense of reason and right and wrong, as long as I know that, I have to oppose this. I am opposed to it.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, if you have any questions or comments, leave them in the comments. And thank you for hearing us out.
Thank you.